Some movies fail once. They bomb at the box office, get dragged by critics, and quietly disappear into the void of streaming obscurity. That's a normal movie failure, but it takes a very special kind of disaster to fail a second time on purpose after already being a punchline. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the story of Morbius, the 2022 Sony Spider-Man film that embarrassed itself in theaters, became one of the most mocked movies on the internet, and then somehow convinced its own studio that the mocking was actually love, before bombing again spectacularly. I'm gonna walk you through the full story, how it got made, why it failed, how the memes took over, and why the second failure might actually be funnier than the first. Buckle up. To understand why Morbius failed, you have to understand what Sony was trying to do, and just how shaky the whole foundation was from day one. After Disney consolidated most of Marvel's characters, Sony was left holding a relatively small hand. They had Spider-Man, but they licensed him back to Disney for the MCU. What they kept was the supporting cast, the villains, the side characters, and they thought, hey, if Venom can make $800 million, maybe we can build a whole cinematic universe out of Spider-Man's rogues gallery. Spoiler, they could not. The character of Morbius, a living vampire and Spider-Man villain from the comics, was greenlit into 2017 as part of this plan. And look, Morbius isn't a terrible character on the page, but here's the thing, nobody outside the comic book community had any idea who he was. You say Venom and people know. You say Morbius and they look at you like you just sneezed. The script was handed to Burke Sharpless and Matt Sazama, who you may recognize from such classics as Gods of Egypt and Dracula Untold. Already, the ceiling for this film was becoming visible. For the director's chair, both Antoine Fuqua and F. Gary Gray were offered the job. Both turned it down. The honor eventually went to Daniel Espinosa, who had just made Life for Sony. A decent film, but nothing that screamed franchise launcher. And then there's the casting of Jared Leto in the lead role. I'll keep it measured and say, Jared Leto is not a box office draw. His name does not put people in seats. And yet Sony handed him a superhero film and hoped for the best. In a now legendary behind-the-scenes story, Leto chose to stay in character as the limping Doctor Morbius even off camera, using crutches at all times on set. He became so slow to move around that the crew eventually resorted to pushing him in a wheelchair just to keep production on schedule. This man was committed to the bit for Morbius. Dog, it's Morbius. Principal photography wrapped in June 2019. Then the delays started. The film's original July 2020 release date was pushed back due to COVID, then pushed again and again and again. The film would ultimately be delayed six times before finally landing on April 1st, 2022. April Fool's Day. I cannot stress enough that this was not intentional. Along the way, reshoots were ordered, not just for pandemic reasons, but reportedly because of script problems. And then there was the first trailer, which showed Michael Keaton's Vulture and Spider-Man graffiti on a wall, strongly implying this was set in the MCU. It wasn't. That graffiti was added in post-production without the director's knowledge. Keaton's scenes were largely cut, and audiences were left confused about what universe this film even existed in, a confusion that never really went away. Morbius opened on April 1st, 2022, and fittingly, it was kind of a joke. Opening weekend, $39 million. Good enough for number one at the box office, which Sony was apparently very excited about. But then came week 2. The film dropped 73% in its second weekend. That's not a dip, that's a cliff. To put it in perspective, that's the second worst second weekend collapse in superhero movie history. Only beaten by the 1997 Shaquille O'Neal masterpiece Steel, word had gotten out and people were not going back or sending their friends. By the end of its run, Morbius had made $73.9 million domestic and $93.4 million overseas, $167.5 million worldwide. Against a production budget of $83 million, you'd think that sounds okay. But here's the rule Hollywood tries very hard not to advertise. A movie needs roughly 2.5 times its budget just to break even, once marketing, distribution, and theater cuts are factored in. By that math, Morbius needed around 200 million, and it didn't get there. Sony publicly claimed the film turned a profit. Analysts were not convinced. Either way, this was not the franchise launcher they needed it to be. The reviews made the box office look like good news. Morbius currently holds a 15th 15% on Rotten Tomatoes, a 5.1 on IMDb, and a 35 on Metacritic. It earned Razzie nominations for Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Actor, and Worst Screenplay, and won Worst Actor for Jared Leto and Worst Supporting Actress. A true sweep. The film had failed, visually and comprehensively, but the story was only just beginning. After Morbius left theaters, something strange happened on the internet. People started ironically praising it as a misunderstood masterpiece. Memes flooded Twitter and Reddit, claiming it was the first film to gross $1 more billion. A catchphrase, "It's Morbin time," a line that it's not actually in the movie, went completely viral. People were sharing edits, fake reviews, fake quotes. It became a genuine cultural moment, and it was hilarious. But, and this is crucial, it was a joke. Every single person participated in it knew it was a joke. The entire premise of the meme was that the movie was bad. The irony was the point. One of the all-time great moments from this era. Actor Tyrese Gibson, who appears in the film, shared what he believed was a real Martin Scorsese quote praising Morbius. He deleted it shortly after realizing it was completely fabricated, which is itself a perfect encapsulation of the whole Morbius experience. Now here's where it gets almost poetic in its stupidity. Sony looked at all this online activity, the memes, the trending hashtags, the apparent enthusiasm, and thought, the people love Morbius. We should bring it back to theaters. In June 2022, Morbius was re-released into over 1,000 theaters. It had already been available on video on demand. The ironic memeing was at its absolute peak, and Sony genuinely believed this was demand. The re-release grossed approximately $300,000 from over 1,000 screens. That's roughly $300 per screen. For context, a decent wide release film might make $10,000 to $20,000 per screen in a weekend. Morbius made $300. Sony pulled it from theaters after just a few days. The meme community celebrated, and someone at Sony hopefully had a very serious conversation with whoever greenlit the re-release. The internet then launched a change.org petition demanding a third theatrical run, with the explanation that we were all busy that weekend. Nobody has ever loved a bad movie this much while actually hating it. Okay, so we've covered the circus, but let's talk about why Morbius failed as a film and as a franchise attempt, because there are real lessons here beyond just the movie was bad. First, nobody knew who Morbius was. Venom works because even people who never read a comic knew Venom from the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, from merchandise, from years of cultural osmosis. Morbius had none of that. You were asking audiences to show up for a character they'd never heard of, in a universe they weren't sure was connected to the MCU, staring an actor people feel neutral about, at best. That is a very hard shell. Second, the MCU confusion actively hurt them. When that first trailer dropped with Vulture and Spider-Man graffiti, people assumed MCU. When it became clear this was its own separate pocket universe, a significant chunk of the audience checked out. The film needed to be definitely one thing or the other. Instead, it existed in a no man's land that satisfied nobody. And third, 6 release date changes and multiple rounds of reshots told the audience something was wrong before they ever bought a ticket. Those signals land. But what about the actual movie? Is it as bad as the 15% Rotten Tomatoes score suggests? Mostly, yes. Morbius isn't unwatchable. It's not Birdemic, but it's a film that seems deeply afraid of itself. It's too dark to be fun, too goofy to be taken seriously, and it has a protagonist with all the magnetic screen presence of a damp paper towel. The villain turn from Milo, his childhood friend who also gets vampire powers, happens so abruptly it's almost comedic. One moment they're friends, the next he's a full supervillain in a leather jacket. Matt Smith is a genuinely great actor who has absolutely nothing to work with here. The love interest exists purely to be put in danger, the 2 detective characters exist purely to repeat exposition, the action, the supposed crowd-pleasing centerpiece of any superhero film, is a blur of ugly digital smoke effects and 2 CGI blobs throwing each other into walls. Visually incoherent is putting it kindly. And the end credit scene, teasing a Vulture team-up that will never happen, features this line of dialogue. I don't know how I got here, but I think it has something to do with Spider-Man. That made it into the finished film. Through every draft, every reshoot, every approval process, whoever signed off on that line owes everyone who saw it an apology. Following Morbius, Sony's Spider-Man universe continued to stumble. 2024 gave us Madame Web and Kraven the Hunter, both of which performed even worse. Kraven made just $62 million against a $120 million budget and is widely considered to have ended the SSU entirely. The people who made Morbius have been refreshingly candid. Matt Smith: "It was thrown under the bus. It is what it is." Jared Harrison taking the role: "I have a mortgage to pay." Director Espinosa in 2024: "He regretted the film and felt a different director would have been a better fit." Will we ever see Morbius again? In the age of the multiverse, nothing is ever truly dead. But with the SSU shuttered and Sony repositioning, a sequel seems extraordinarily unlikely. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Morbius is a movie that failed for almost every reason a movie can fail. Bad reviews, audience confusion, a lead nobody was excited about, a franchise strategy built on sand, and then just when meme culture threatened to give it a second life, its own studio didn't understand the joke and handed it a second failure on a silver platter. It's not the worst superhero movie ever made, but it might be the most instructive one. A perfect case study in what happens when a studio makes IP ownership for audience interest and confuses online mockery for genuine love. That's Morbius, one of the movies of all time. What are your thoughts? Have you seen it? Did you participate in the memes? What's your least favorite Sony Spider-Man universe movie? Let me know.